Get started. For those who don't know me, my name is Titus Chen. I'm associate professor here at the Institute of Political Science, National Sun Yat-sen University. But today I'm not the main actor here. My job is to introduce the speaker today, Professor Brent Benson. We are extremely fortunate to have a guest lecturer who come here in person rather than, on screen. Professor Benson is associate professor at Political Science Department at Vanderbilt University. I believe that's in Nashville, Tennessee. Never been there. I heard about it. He also is an affiliated faculty at the Asian Studies program of Vanderbilt. His research interest, he has, of course, multiple research interests, and they include international relations, Chinese politics, East Asian relations. He has worked on military alliances, interstate conflict, and he authored this book titled Constructing International Security, Alliances, Deterrence, and Moral Hazard, all the major and exciting subjects in IR. His book was published by Cambridge University Press back in 2012. His current research focuses on the role of weapons system in international politics, and he studies nuclear weapons and the strategies that countries use to reduce proliferation, the relationship between the sale of conventional weapons and the military alliances, and the effects of small arms market on interstate conflicts. He also is involved in a project examining the effect of religious bias on voters' decisions in the US presidential election. Having said that, today he's going to give a talk that has maybe less to do with presidential election in the US, nor that much about nuclear weapons or non-proliferation, proliferation treaties. Instead, he's going to give a talk focused on cross-strait relations, Taiwan-China relations. I remember his first book, the one I just mentioned, published by Cambridge University Press, Taiwan was a significant case studies in that book about the deterrence, about military commitment, about strategic ambiguity that the US government has practiced in Taiwan and in cross-strait relations. So today, I believe, will give a much updated and much progressing talk based on his previous book. So the title is Kicking the Can Down the Road, Strategic Delay in Crisis Bargaining and the 1992 Consensus. I don't think I need to explain furthermore about what 92 Consensus is about. So without further ado, Professor Benson, you have it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that warm introduction. I'm grateful to Sun Yat-sen University and the Institute of Political Science for inviting me here today. It's a great privilege being here on this beautiful campus. This is one of the most beautiful campuses I've ever been on, and I think that you are all lucky to be able to be students here on this beautiful campus. So this topic about the night. Oh, thank you. Okay, can you all hear me? Okay. I'm going to speak in English, and I'm going to also talk about game theory, and so what I want to do in the next however long we're together is make sure that you understand that you can ask me questions at any point during the conversation. In some talks, it's tradition to give the talk and then wait to the end, and then you can ask questions. Please feel free to interrupt me and ask questions at any point. That's the standard that we use in my department, and that's what I'm accustomed to. And so if you have any question that comes to your mind, please interrupt.
How about questions in Chinese? Is that
You can also ask questions in Chinese, and one of these fine professors here will translate for me. No, you can ask questions in Chinese.
Because you go to Chinese company.
Yeah. 我可以听得懂.
Actually, Chinese is pretty good, yours.
是吗? Oh, thank you so much.
所以你们可以放心这
Way
样
beyond
子。
average.
Yeah. I'll speak slowly in English if you promise to speak slowly in Chinese when you ask me questions. 公平吗? Okay.
Fair.
And then when I talk about game theory, I'll talk even slower, because game theory is a method that we use in political science, as you all know, and but it can be complicated sometimes. But there is a benefit to it. The benefit to using game theory is that game theory helps us structure the way that we think about very complex problems, and it helps us focus on incentives. Since when we study politics, a lot of decisions are about trying to get the best thing that you can get for yourself, given the constraints that you face. And constraints also include other actors. Game theory is a helpful way to help us think about making optimal decisions given those constraints. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that I started when I got here in Taiwan, and I'm going to be using some game theory, but I'm going to present it in a very intuitive way. I have been in Taiwan for 4 months. I got here 12月1号, and then I leave next week. 下个礼拜二, I return to Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee is the home of country music. We have famous people that live in my town, people like Taylor Swift. She has a house that's actually not very far away from my house. She was born and raised in that area. Now she has an even bigger house in Los Angeles. And then there are some other people like Justin Timberlake. He has a house in Nashville, and many recording artists. So there's a lot of music in the city that I live in. But Nashville is located in the southern part of the United States on the east. So who knows what kicking the can down the road means? If you have a passport from the United States, you cannot answer this question. Kicking the can down the road, 什么意思？你知道吗？有没有人知道 kicking the can down the road 有什么意思? If you don't know, I'm going to have to ask those with U.S. passports to answer the question.
Yeah, theirs, they do.
What does it mean?
Delay. You don't want to deal with the problem immediately, so you just delay it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You don't want to deal with the problem right this moment, and so you kick the can down the road. You just wait. It actually doesn't make a lot of sense because there's no reason to actually kick a can. But there's this saying in English, kicking the can down the road, which means that there's a problem right now that we have to solve, and we don't want to solve it right now, and so we're just going to kick the can down the road, and then at some point we keep walking and we'll come to it again, and then we have to solve the problem when we come to it. So that's the title of the talk, kicking the can down the road. In my mind, at least in English, this captures colloquially the logic of the 1992 consensus. What puzzles me, what I'm interested in understanding, is why 1992 consensus came into being, right? It wasn't actually in 1992 that it happened. We all know that it was really around 2000, and Suu Kyi said, you know, there's this thing called 1992 consensus. So really during the 2000s and early 2010 to 2015, 1992 consensus had a lot of currency in Taiwan. It was a major policy position, and a lot of people call it strategic ambiguity. People call it different things. In your mind, you probably have an intuition for what it is. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So I want to know why it was useful, why it came into being, what problems it solved. In game theory, we typically think that something happens if it solves a problem, if it solves an incentive problem. But I also want to know why it just disappeared. In the last 5 years, it has become decreasingly popular. It's not as popular anymore. And now there are really no politicians. Well, there's some, but very few politicians are willing to say that they that they want 1992 consensus. And if you look at public opinion polling, people don't like 1992 consensus anymore. So the question is, why did it come into being? What problem did it solve? What benefit did it have? And then why did it disappear? That's the puzzle, okay? Now there's an even deeper puzzle for those of us who study international relations. This is a puzzle that we all should care about. In international relations theory, and I'll show you this in just a second, but in international relations theory, we think that when you bargain, when two players bargain with each other, even if it's the case that they are going to bargain over time, it's usually in their interest to solve the bargaining problem sooner rather than later. And so, at least in terms of international relations theory, when countries bargain with each other, from a theoretical standpoint, they're better off solving the problem now, making a demand and settling out through negotiations now, and not to wait. It's rare that you get an incentive to delay. Now, sometimes if somebody's really patient and the other side is not patient, then the patient side in bargaining can take advantage of the other side by delaying. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a situation where both sides of the Taiwan Strait, Zhongguo Dalu and Taiwan side, both agree tacitly for like 15 years to kick the can down the road or to delay. In bargaining, that's very rare. So sometimes in international relations, we can understand why one side would want to delay because they are more patient and they want to take advantage of the other side. But we don't have a good theory for understanding why two sides, when they're trying to bargain over something that they both disagree about, why both sides would be interested in delaying. So this is a curiosity, both because I want to understand why it was popular in Taiwan, so at least from a practical standpoint, I'm interested. But also from a theoretical standpoint, it's important for us to understand why this happens. Now, the way that I study Taiwan is like this. Taiwan for me is a very, very important place in the world because we have lots of international relations theories, and you're studying all these theories now with excellent professors who are teaching you about international relations theories, like deterrence, and there's some theories about alliances, and there's some theories about how wars start, and things like that. There are all these theories. Taiwan is 很有趣 because Taiwan is a counterexample to many of our theories in international relations. Like, for example, we believe that for a commitment to be credible, for a deterrence commitment to be credible, and I'm sure you have studied this over and over again, it needs to be transparent, and it needs to be clearly communicated, and it needs to be irrevocable, which means that you can't go back on it. A credible commitment. In international relations, we have talked about this for 50, 60 years, ever since those famous books by people like Thomas Schelling, right? So for a deterrence commitment to be credible, it has to be irrevocable. You can't go back on it. Tie your hands. And it has to be transparently communicated. But the policy that the United States and Taiwan have used as a security commitment for decades has been strategic ambiguity, which is not transparent, and it's not irrevocable. And so it's not credible, and yet it has been more or less successful. So Taiwan is like that. It presents a puzzle to us in international relations because there are so many theories and Taiwan doesn't quite fit. But Taiwan continues to survive. And so Taiwan is good for those of us who study international relations because there's so many interesting things we can learn from this place. So that's what I do. I study international relations. I'm a theorist. But what I'm interested in is Taiwan, China, East Asia, Guangxi, because there are lots of new things that we can learn here, and then we can scale them up and generalize and apply them to our general understanding of international relations theory. This, I'm hoping, will do the same thing. So by understanding why, in this particular case, there's an incentive to kick the can down the road or to delay bargaining, why both sides have an interest in agreeing on that, that's a new insight. And hopefully that will teach us about delay in bargaining between nations more generally. Under what conditions does that happen beyond Taiwan? Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm now going to present this project to you and explain to you why it's interesting, but I'm going to start by explaining what the puzzle is, the theoretical puzzle, not just the Taiwan puzzle. Okay, first of all, let us understand, let us come to an agreement about what 1992 consensus is. And some of you may have more expertise than me on this, and so if I'm wrong, then just disagree, it's okay. Raise your hand and say, yeah, that's not right. And then you can explain to me what's wrong. So my understanding of 1992 consensus, at least since 2000, when Suu Kyi said that this is the 1992 consensus, one China, two interpretations, right? Now from a bargaining standpoint, this doesn't mean that much. In bargaining, it's actually the case that you have demands. We all believe, I think we can agree, and most people in the world believe that China and Taiwan are bargaining over the sovereignty of Taiwan. Even when they're not talking to each other, they're bargaining. Bargaining is happening whether they're talking to each other or not. Bargaining is always happening. Why? Because both sides want the same thing. Both sides want the sovereignty of Taiwan. And so everything that they do when it comes to this issue is called bargaining. Sometimes they're doing things like flying airplanes closer and closer. That's part of bargaining. Sometimes they're doing things like inviting the UN ambassador, US UN ambassador to Taiwan. That's bargaining too. All this is bargaining. It's coercive bargaining sometimes it's peaceful bargaining, but this is what bargaining is in international relations. So one China, two interpretations, this is a definition, but it's not actually bargaining. Because having two interpretations just means you can say what you want about what one China is, and I can say what I want about what one China is, and right now it doesn't matter. Right now it's okay. You say what you want, and I say what I want, but nobody is making any demands. It's not bargaining until somebody makes a demand or actually takes something, okay? So basically what this means, it's effectively the same thing as saying, we are agreeing to delay. We agree that there's this one thing called one China, and we're not going to say anything else about it right now. Someday we will, but right now we won't. The two interpretations part means we can disagree and not make any demands right now. So we're going to kick the can down the road and not bargain right now, okay? So it's a tacit agreement to wait until some unspecified time in the future to bargain, to kick the can down the road. Now, one thing that we believe is true, maybe in the 1990s, I don't think that there was agreement on this. Starting in 2001, when China entered the WTO, especially in 2008, when China hosted the Olympics, most people in the world believed that China's power was growing stronger. And in the future, China would be even stronger than they are today. Most people in Taiwan believe that. Most people in Taiwan's government believe that China was getting stronger. In the 1990s, I think it's fair to say that a lot of people believed that maybe China might collapse. And so the belief about China's power was different in the 1990s than in the 2000s. I think a lot of people, after Tiananmen, Izhou Bajonian, right after that, a lot of people thought maybe China will collapse. So maybe China won't get stronger. But starting in 2001 and going forward, at the beginning of Chen Shui-bian administration, I think most people understood that China was getting stronger. Now this is the puzzle in terms of theory. If you and I are bargaining with each other today over something that we disagree about, we're bargaining. If we're just bargaining with each other today, right now, and you know that tomorrow I will have more bargaining power, which means tomorrow I can get more from you when we bargain. Do you want to settle this dispute today or tomorrow? Today, right? That's 废话. Of course, if I'm getting stronger tomorrow, and if I'm even stronger the next day, you don't want to wait. You want to solve this problem right now and come to an agreement. So if it's the case that everybody in the 2000s knew that China was getting stronger, next year they'll be even stronger. After the Beijing Olympics, 2010, they're going to be even stronger. If we wait till 2020, they're going to be really strong. All these projections are that China is going to be the strongest country in the world. Their military is getting stronger. If you believe that they're going to be stronger tomorrow, why would you agree to kick the can down the road? This is the puzzle. If we're bargaining with each other in the 2000s, why would anybody in their right mind agree to wait instead of solving the problem? I think this is why we saw so much pressure during Chen Shui-bian administration to move toward independence. because people started to realize China's going to get stronger. If we wait to solve this problem, if we wait and bargain in the future, we are going to be at a disadvantage. And so there was a lot of pressure during the early 2000s to solve this problem now. So, if you have questions, make sure you ask. So, if it's common knowledge that China's power is getting stronger, then why would any actor in a relatively good bargaining position ever delay bargaining when it knows that its opponent is going to be stronger in the future? In my mind, this goes to the very heart of the puzzle about 1992 consensus. If you look at public opinion polls in the 2000s, so many people agreed with 1992 consensus. There were some people that agreed with Taiwan Duli, but there are also a lot of people that agreed with 1992 consensus. But if you also look at public opinion polls, a lot of people knew that China was getting stronger, which means that people simultaneously, at the same time, wanted to wait, and they also knew that China was going to get stronger. Why? So this is the problem.
The problem is that we want to see the democracy prevail in China.
Yeah.
That is our problem.
So now you stole my thunder. I don't have anything else to say. No, this is right.
Presumed to be there.
Yeah, I think this is true. But it has very specific implications. So here's some questions about 1992 consensus, and then I have some other more general questions about the theory. How did it work, and what are the benefits? So how did 1992 consensus work? Why did it get traction? Why did so many people agree with it? And then why did it get put aside in recent years? And can a version of 1992 consensus, is there a new version that would work today? Hopefully you can help me with this. And then in terms of theory, IR, international relations theory, why delay bargaining when an opponent will be stronger in the future? Okay, that's the question that we've been asking. And can strategic delay reduce the possibility of armed conflict? This is an important question. So even if we think that the reason for this is that maybe China will be democratic in the future, that's true. But the bigger question is, does something like 1992 consensus in the 2000s, does it not just buy time, but does it actually reduce the likelihood that there will be a war? If so, then it's good, right? And then under what conditions does strategic delay preserve the status quo in the near term? What has to be true in a country for something like 1992 consensus to 维持现状? Does it always work, or does it only work under some conditions? That's one of the useful features of game theory, is that it actually helps us pin down the specific conditions under which these types of things are equilibrium, or the conditions under which they will work. Okay, so I'm sure that you're all much better at math than me. So I'm going to introduce some math concepts. I'm going to introduce some game theoretic concepts, but it's okay. I'm going to express the intuition, and then if you have questions, ask me. But before we do this, I'm going to just do something a little bit cavalier. Can I just draw on the board? Is that okay? Sure. Okay. Let me show you what bargaining looks like in game theory. You've probably seen this, but I'm just going to, for the sake of repeating it. So if two countries are bargaining over something, call it Taiwan, Taiwan sovereignty. The way that we have reduced this problem in international relations and from a game theoretic standpoint is this way. So you have two actors. Let's call player one China. So China makes a move, and it demands, we'll just call it X. So what we're going to do to simplify things is we're going to call Taiwan sovereignty, a set of things that China can demand, X. And it can only demand up to 1, and it can demand no less than 0, which is easy because then we can say that X is some percent of Taiwan. Now sometimes for some people this is just too callous, right? Taiwan is not a percentage. Taiwan is not a number. You can't divide Taiwan in half. Actually, that's not true. If sovereignty for Taiwan is 0, that means China gets nothing. and sovereignty of Taiwan for China is 1, Taiwan already is somewhere in the middle. It's not 0 or 1. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's already something in the middle. For a long time, Hong Kong has been something in between 0 and 1. In truth, countries all the time and territories throughout history have made arrangements that are something less than fully sovereign. There are lots of territories in the world. I mean, is Puerto Rico, is it sovereign? Well, they kind of run things by themselves, but they don't really belong to the United States. Taiwan is somewhere in between. Now, was Hong Kong as sovereign as Taiwan? No. So if 1 is like Jiangsu province, because it belongs fully to China, and 0 is something like Japan, it doesn't belong to China at all, then Taiwan is somewhere in between. We can call it maybe 0.5. It doesn't matter. We can quantify it if we wanted to. If that's the case, then Hong Kong is more like 0.75, right? So this happens all the time. So we call this a pie. And you can call the pie whatever you want. Countries and political actors, they disagree all the time, and they try to figure out how to come to some sort of a political arrangement.
So 1 represents the total loss of sovereignty
For Taiwan.
from the perspective of
Taiwan.
Of X.
Yeah, so X is the size of the demand. So China is the first actor. China has a move, and its move is X. It can demand anything from 0 to 1. If China says, we want everything, then they're demanding X equal 1. If China says, you know what, we don't want Taiwan anymore, we'll demand X equals 0. That means Taiwan 独立, right? If China says, okay, we're willing to wait for Xinjiang, then they're saying, we're demanding X equal to Q, which is status quo, equal to whatever the status quo is, 0.5 or something like that. Does that make sense to everybody? And so this right here, 0 to 1, is a pie. I just call it pie. You know what a pie is. How many ways can you divide the pie? If I eat the whole pie, then I get X equal to 1 if I'm China. If I let you eat the whole pie, then I get X equals 0. If I eat 50% of the pie, then you get 0.5, I get 0.5. Okay? So China gets X. Taiwan gets 1 minus X. Okay? So China makes a demand X, and then Taiwan can move. And it can accept, or it can reject. Now, in bargaining theory, we say that if it rejects, then something happens. In most cases, we say that if there's a rejection, then there's a war, right? So, if Taiwan rejects China's offer, then there's a war. If it accepts, then there's some peaceful solution, okay? Now, they can renegotiate that after there's some, so that means that China gets X, because that's what China demanded, and then Taiwan would get 1 minus X, right? 很简单, straightforward. And then China might move again, and you can keep bargaining, right? This is the same thing as this. So you can get ongoing bargaining that takes place. And if they continue, if you continue to get the same outcome, then you have an equilibrium and it's stable. Now, there are a couple things that are true about bargaining. One is that in most bargaining theories, the demand that China makes here will either be accepted or rejected in the first period, which means that in most cases, neither country has an incentive to delay. Now, sometimes you can get delay in equilibrium, like I said, if one side is more patient than the other side. But we're going to find an equilibrium where both sides have an incentive to delay. That's what's interesting about this. Now, what happens if there's war? This is the important part. What happens if there's war? So when you bargain over anything, maybe you're buying a car or something like that, and you're talking to the person who's selling you a car, and you want them to give you the lowest price possible. They want to take as much money as possible. Are there any threats that you can make? You can just walk out. And what strengthens that threat to walk away? So usually, most people who try to sell cars, they don't believe you unless you back up that threat with something. What strengthens that threat is if you say, I can get the same price for the same car for a better price over here. We call that an outside option. You know, I might not disagree with the offer that you're giving me or the demand that you're making because I can get a better option if I walk away from you and walk away from bargaining. Well, we're going to treat war as an outside option. If we're bargaining with each other, you make a demand that I don't like, then I can walk away and just fight you. And we can see who will win, right? That's an outside option. So for the person who sells you a car, if they know what your outside option is, or they know what you can get the same car, the price that you can get the same car for, then they need to make sure that they are under that price, right? And the person who's selling a car, if they have another customer who's willing to buy it for a certain price, then you know that they have an outside option. And so I need to buy that car for at least the same amount that they would sell it to another person. And so that gives us a bargaining space. Their outside option and my outside option. That's the bargaining space. War is going to give us the outside option, and it's going to actually produce the bargaining space for bargaining. And this is what drives a lot of international relations theory today. The value of war fighting for both sides. So the value of war fighting depends upon the value of the pie. The value of the pie is 1, right? Because we've already normalized it. It's just 1. If you get the whole pie, you get 1. With some probability, I win that, the whole pie. If we fight, with some probability you win, and that probability is related, right? If I'm really powerful and the probability that I can win the pie is 90%, that means the probability that you can win the pie if we fight is 10%. And then we pay war costs, and that's how we pin it down. So just doing a little bit of simple math, for China, we're going to say that P is the probability that China can win a war. So China can win the war. They can, with some probability P, they can win the whole pie and get 1. With some probability, 1 minus P, they lose, and then they get 0, and then they pay their war costs. I think I say C is the war cost. You can't see this, but C is the war cost. Ah! C is the war cost, okay? And then this just reduces to P minus C. 很简单. Now for Taiwan, this is China. Taiwan's war payoff, with some probability, Taiwan loses because China wins. So with some probability that China wins, Taiwan gets 0. But with some probability, Taiwan wins, and then they get the whole thing minus Taiwan's war costs, we'll call Taiwan player 2. And so this is 1 minus P minus C2. So when China makes a demand X, it has to make sure that Taiwan gets at least as much as Taiwan would get here. Well, Taiwan gets 1 minus X if it's peaceful. So 1 minus X must be greater than or equal to this, because this is what Taiwan's war payoff is. Okay? And of course, this is X has to be less than P plus C2. So if China wants to make a peaceful offer to Taiwan, they have to make sure that they demand less than what Taiwan could get if they go to war. Okay? But of course, X has to be greater than this, because China will just fight if remember, X is always what China gets. If X is less than this, then China's outside option is to fight and get this. So if X is too low, China will fight. If X is greater than this, and also greater than this, then Taiwan will fight. So if X is greater than this, but less than this, then you have peace. Okay? Very simple and straightforward. This is the most simple way to think about bargaining between countries. And then there are lots of papers produced by people like James Fearon and others, and this is basically what we get when we try to understand rationalist explanations for war. So P is the probability in time 1, in this period, that China can win. Well, remember we said that China is getting stronger over time. That means in the next period, P is actually greater. So we're going to say P prime is, in time 2, the probability that China can win, and P prime is bigger than P, because China is getting more powerful. So this is important. So P prime minus P is positive, because China is getting more powerful, and we're going to call it delta P. This is the size of China's power rise. So this is 1990s, 2000s, when China and Taiwan are bargaining. And then this is in time 2, okay? And then here are the costs of war. So instead of working through this with a lot of math, I'm going to show you graphically what it looks like. So now here we have a bargaining space. And this bargaining space represents X. How much can China get? Can China get X equals 0? Or can China get X equal 1? What does China want? Of course it wants X equal 1. So the more you go in this direction, the happier China is, but Taiwan gets less and less happy. So if X equals this, that means China gets all of this, and Taiwan only gets this much. So the bargaining space, remember, is pinned down by the outside options for war. So P plus C2, this is what Taiwan can get if it fights. So P is the probability that China wins. And then these are the war costs. And P is the probability that China can win. And this is the war cost for China. So it's P minus C1. So if China gets only this much, X less than this, then China's not happy and it would rather fight a war. Because this is China's payoff for fighting a war. If X is greater than this, then China's happy. It will take any outcome here more than war, because now it's getting something that pays it more than war. But remember, the farther you go this direction, Taiwan is getting unhappy, right? If you cross over this line, then Taiwan says, look, I would rather just fight. So between this point and this point, you have the possibility for peace. The only reason that's possible is because of the war costs, right? The war costs, if it weren't for the war costs, then you would have only one possible peaceful settlement. And in game theory, we say this is zero measure. It's impossible to find this, because this was one little point on an infinitesimal scale. But because war is expensive, both sides would prefer to settle this peacefully than to fight a war. It's actually in their interest to settle this peacefully. So at time 1, back in the 2000s, we're going to say that Taiwan has a lot of bargaining leverage. If China demands something up here, then Taiwan's going to say, let's fight. They won't actually say, let's fight. They'll say, Taiwan du li, and then that will cause a fight. Okay? But if it's less than this, if Taiwan says, no, you can't have X, you can only have X down here, which means you can have nothing, then China would say, okay, let's fight. Let's fight over Taiwan. Let's just see what happens. Now, if you are China, and you're a smart bargain strategist, and you're in China, and you're advising whoever was in power at this time, Jiang Zemin. So, if you were in China and you were advising the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, where would you advise them to make a demand? Would you say, demand this? Would you say, you should demand this much? Would you say, you should demand this much? Would you say, you should demand this much? No, this causes a war. Remember, if they demand this much, this causes a war because Taiwan says, no, we'll fight. And then what does China get if they fight a war? China only gets this much if they fight a war. So any demand that's too much means that China only gets this much. So the best they can do is to, in maximizing demand, is to go all the way out to the edge of the bargaining space. This is just like that person who wants to sell you a car. Remember? They want to know exactly what your outside option is, because they know it's better for you just to stay here and not walk away. So they will give you the exact same price that you can get by walking away and buying it from somebody else. So this is China. They're going to extract as much of the bargaining surplus as possible and demand this much. So this is the settlement before the power shift in Taiwan. Now what happens in time 2? This is really important for understanding what the incentives of policymakers on both sides of the Taiwan Strait were in the early 2000s. What happens in time 2? So in time 2, this is time 1, in time 2, China gets stronger. P prime is greater than P, which means that any peaceful settlement in time 2 is going to be better for China than any peaceful settlement in time 1. Well, this is kind of obvious. But one implication of waiting is that China is, this is the settlement after the power shift. China is going to increase what they can get by this much. So today they can get this much. Tomorrow they can get this much. And so if they wait, they're actually going to do better. If they try to settle it out today, then they're not going to do as well. An expectation, if they wait, they can do more. So the question is not just why does Taiwan want to wait? The question is why does China, why do both sides want to wait? By waiting, China gets more, but Taiwan gets less, okay? So one implication is that by waiting, Taiwan gets less. But there's another more insidious, more dangerous implication. So greater bargaining concessions in the future. This is bad for Taiwan. So two possibilities. But the other possibility, what if the power shift is really big? It goes all the way out here. China's power shift in the last few years is one of the biggest power shifts in the history of the world. China went from 1989 almost collapsing to today being one of the most powerful countries in the history of the world. So China, its power shift is enormous. So one possibility is that in the future Taiwan has to give more to China if Taiwan waits. But another possibility is if that power shift is too big, then Taiwan might actually at time 1 want to fight a preventive war to make sure that China doesn't rise. Because it knows that it's going to be able to take almost everything in the future. So this is one of the dangerous things, and this is one of the rationalist explanations for war is called the commitment problem, right? If that power shift is too big at time 2, then if Taiwan fights here in time 1 and locks in, then Taiwan can get this in period 1. But at time 2, it could get the same thing because it fought a war. And this became fait accompli, and then it gets the same thing here. If Taiwan has to wait into the future and only get this much, then maybe fighting a war here and getting this much, and then locking that in and getting this much in time 2 is better than this plus this. So if the power shift is too big, then countries actually have an incentive. The countries that are on the losing end of that power shift, sometimes if that power shift is too big, they have an incentive to pick a fight today. So this is actually consistent with what a lot of people were thinking in the 2000s. China's getting more powerful. If we wait, we're going to be able to get less out of them. Maybe we're better off just declaring independence today. This is what made Chen Shui-bian popular in the early 2000s. And taking our risk with a war today. Because at least we might be able to get that today, and then we could lock in. Even if it means a fight. If we wait, it's just going to get worse. So there are two possible implications. If China's power is rising, one, at a minimum, Taiwan has to give more to China in the future. But the worst case scenario is if that power shift is too big, then it might actually even cause a war. Okay? So the question is, how big does the power shift have to be to cause a war? Now this is a theoretical construct, but it has a lot of purchase in empirical analysis, so it has been tested. And I have a paper right now that shows that power shifts with alliances. It's Revise and Resubmit at American Journal of Political Science, so my fingers are crossed, I'm very happy. It shows that power shifts from alliances, new alliances, can be so big that they cause the target to want to attack before that alliance is formed to prevent that alliance from happening. And then in my article, I have a case study about Mao Zedong attacking the offshore islands in the 1950s to try to prevent the United States and Taiwan from signing an alliance. So if the power shift is too big, this is actually true. This happens in international politics. So how big does it have to be? Well, here's the theoretical result. If the power shift, this is P minus P prime, if the power shift between period 1 and period 2 is greater than this amount, then there will be a war in period 1. If that power shift is so big, well, you know, how big is it? So I call this U under bar. So this is now not X. This is the size of the power shift. This is delta. If the power shift is below U under bar, then Taiwan is just going to have to make a lot of concessions. But if it's bigger than this, then there will be a war in the 2000s. Well, there wasn't a war in the 2000s, and we'll talk about why that was in just a second. Okay, but if that power shift is above this, then the prediction is war, and then of course we have to take it to the data to find out whether it's true. This changes with the cost of war. This delta is a common discount factor for how much countries value the future. If war costs go up, that means this goes up. So the more expensive it is to fight a war, the more likely it is that you will get concessions instead of war. Okay? So I put this up here because we're going to come back and compare it in just a minute after we analyze 1992 consensus. Okay, so if it's this is just basic bargaining theory. If it's the case that two countries are bargaining with each other, Taiwan and Taiwan knows that China is going to get more powerful, if it waits, then there are two possibilities. One is in the future, China is going to be more powerful and Taiwan is going to have to make more concessions, which means it's going to have to give up more of its sovereignty in the future. Or it can declare independence early, cause a war, but maybe it can lock in. So if the power shift is high, this is the prediction. Neither of these things happened. So why was that the case? Okay, so now we're going to talk about 1992 consensus, because the backdrop helps us understand what Taiwan was trying to avoid in the 1990s and what China was wanting to avoid. What's interesting about this is that the preventive war, China doesn't want that either. So if the power shift is going to be too big, and China knows the power shift is going to be too big, Taiwan knows the power shift is going to be too big, then there's enormous pressure early on to declare independence, to lock in. China knows that, Taiwan knows that, and the war is bad for both sides, actually. And so maybe if they can figure out a way to delay, then you can avoid this pressure for a preventive war. Okay, so what other things were happening? Why would a country want to delay bargaining, in this case Taiwan, when the opponent is getting stronger? What if we believe that the value of this pie, this, is actually going to grow in the future? So, like you said, maybe one of those beliefs is that in the future China might be democratic, which is valuable to Taiwan. And not just that China will be democratic, but that Taiwan will be the model for China's democracy. And so if there's a one China, a one democratic China, and Taiwan is the model for that, then Taiwan can have a lot of influence. Taiwan in the 2000s is also very rich. China is just starting to grow. Maybe Taiwan can be, you know, a big difference maker in China's economy. There are lots of possible ways that the pie can get more valuable for people in Taiwan, right? So this is the way we think about this. In period 2, if there's some probability, R, right, some probability R between 0 and 1, that the value of the pie will be greater for Taiwan, then maybe there's a chance. So how do we model this? If the pie grows, then there's some multiplier, lambda, which is greater than 1. And that denotes the increase in the value of the pie. So if it's the case that in the future I get x times lambda, and lambda is greater than 1, then I actually get more tomorrow than I would get today. So even if it's the case that I get less tomorrow in terms of x, if you multiply that by lambda, that actually might be better for me than it is for today. So if there's some probability that the value of the pie will grow, and it'll grow by this much, lambda, then maybe there's some incentive for me to delay. So did there actually exist a belief in Taiwan in the 2000s that the pie would grow? Did Taiwanese elites and voters believe that there was a chance that China might liberalize political and economic institutions? Would such changes increase the value of one China to Taiwan? let's look. So that's a lot of words, I'm sorry. So this is Li Denghui, oh I said 2000. This is actually his 1990 first inaugural address. Don't pay any attention to that, that's a type error. This is Yi Jiujiu, his first inaugural address. He said, today we're entering a new post-Cold War era. The world is full of uncertainties. Communism is dead or dying. Peoples of many nations are anxious to try new methods of governing. There's a lot of stuff here. But the red part, our achievements in Taiwan can most certainly help the process of economic liberalization and the cause of democracy in mainland China, only by following a win-win strategy can the best interests of the Chinese people be served. We believe that mutual respect will gradually lead to the peaceful reunification of China under a system of democracy, freedom, and equitable distribution of wealth. So at least in the inaugural address in 1990, there's this belief that China tomorrow might be a free and democratic China, and Taiwan will be the model for it. That's good. That's better than bargaining over Taiwan now. And maybe there's a chance that something will get better if we wait. This is Chen Shui-bian in 2004. There's some other quotes in that inaugural speech that are pretty important. But even Chen Shui-bian in 2004 said, the first 2 decades of the century will be a crucial time for Taiwan to pursue a comprehensive program. Remember, Chen Shui-bian was trying to diffuse tensions. Right? One possibility is that you can declare independence preventatively. Right? In the previous slide, we saw that actually is a dominant incentive. Maybe that's equilibrium. And there's a lot of people knew this. There's a reason why 1992 consensus came out in 2000, so that both sides could agree, DPP and PMT, on something to delay or kick the can down the road. So in his inaugural addresses, he was under a lot of pressure to reduce that thought from China that Taiwan might make a move like this. So he said, it also represents an opportune moment in history for China to move forward with democratization and liberalization. And then later in the speech he said, I won't do anything to declare independence as long as China doesn't threaten Taiwan. And he said, and what's even possible is some sort of one China arrangement if democracy is on the table. He said any type of negotiation is okay.
So China is an issue.
Chinese issue.
Yeah, but the 92 consensus, China is a principle.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Always.
One China is a principle.
Always different in the words.
Yeah,
yeah. In 2004, survey data, 89% believed China would not attack and that status quo would be preserved. This is an enormous number. So almost everybody in the survey agreed that preserving status quo is possible. I'll show you some data later on, but in more recent polls, hardly anybody believes that the status quo can be preserved anymore. But this means that there was an agreement that there was a possibility that you could preserve the status quo, which by itself was ambiguous, and kick the can down the road. And then Ma Ying-jeou, a lot of words here, but by succeeding, we can make unparalleled contributions to the democratic development of all ethnic Chinese communities. The responsibility is ours, right, Taiwan, to fulfill. In resolving cross-strait issues, what matters is not sovereignty, but core values and a way of life. We care about the welfare of 1.3 billion people on mainland China and hope that mainland China will continue to move toward freedom, democracy, and prosperity for all people. This is really important because he wasn't saying we just care about 23 million people and the sovereignty of 23 million people. That's what this pie is, the sovereignty of 23 million people. He was saying we care about the welfare of 1.3 billion people, democracy, prosperity, and freedom for all those people, which means that we hope that we're not just bargaining over Taiwan sovereignty, we hope we're bargaining for something that has to do with all of China. So if there's some probability, R, greater than 0, that the future brings some value of the pie that's bigger than just 1, then maybe that will offset China's power rise in a way that makes it worthwhile for both sides to kick the can down the road. And then you can call it whatever you want. At the time, it was called 1992 consensus. Some of these things, they lose their purchase because they become politicized. But in the 2000s, that wasn't very politicized. It's a rallying point around the concept. The concept is both sides of the Taiwan Strait tacitly agree not to make any demands backed by the threat of force. I'm not going to back it up by the threat to use my outside option and fight. Call it whatever you want. Tzu Chi gave it a name so that people could rally around it in the 2000s, 1992 consensus. But in truth, it can be called whatever you want it to be called, as long as the principle is the same. So how does it work? So you call this 1992 consensus, but how does the belief that the pie will grow tomorrow affect bargaining? Well, one implication, and these are the implications that nobody thinks about. This is very, very important. One implication is that the demand, remember X is how much China demands. The demand that China makes, do you remember in the previous slide, China will demand all the way up to here. With the 1992 consensus, China actually demands less. Remember, they demand P plus C2. So they demand this much. But then with the delay, the agreement to delay, they take off some of that demand, which means that in the short term, they give some back. They compensate in the short term. They compensate as a way to compensate Taiwan for the risk that they might be more powerful in the future. So the short-term compensation is China says, we won't extract the entire bargaining surplus. We'll split the bargaining surplus with you. How much? Well, the bigger the power shift, and China's power shift was big, we'll pay you to wait the size of the power shift. So you come down this much. And then there's some sort of compensating factors based upon the probability that the pie will grow. The point is that one implication of this agreement to wait is that in the short term, China compensates Taiwan. So in the 2000s, this was a great time for Taiwan because trade spiked between China and Taiwan. Taiwan's economy took off. There are a lot of concessions from China. It does match the theory that as a way of compensating Taiwan for waiting, because remember, Taiwan has an incentive to settle this now. As a way to compensate in the short term, China makes some concessions in the short term. We know you know we're going to get stronger. We know that you know that in the future we're going to be able to take almost everything. But we also know that you think that we might be democratic in the future. So let's just wait, and we'll give you some stuff in the short term to help you compensate for what's going to happen in the future, to convince you to wait. Okay? So this is one of the benefits of the 1992 consensus in the 2000s, is that there's a short-term payoff. The other upside is that it helps preserve the status quo. If it's the case that in time one, the current arrangement is anywhere in this bargaining space, this bargaining space is robust through period one, which means that China and Taiwan won't make any demands in the short term. So this is China and Taiwan, this is China's way of saying, in the short term, we won't demand anything if in the short term you don't declare independence. And that's one of the other implications. So China compensates Taiwan in the 2000s in the short term while China's rising. We compensate you for waiting. And then we also, we don't have to settle anything today. And then this is the third implication, and this one is the most important. So this is not X. This dimension is the size of the power shift. And you remember, if the power shift before, without 1992 consensus, if the power shift crossed this line, then there's strong incentive for a preventive war, or for Taiwan to declare independence, right? What does 1992 consensus do? What does this belief that the future will be better do for this bargaining problem? It increases this to U upper bar. Originally, this is the value of U under bar, right? If there's some value R, right, some probability that the future will be better, and these are Taiwan's war costs, weighted by Taiwan's war costs. And if it's the case that you think the value of the pie in the future is going to be really big, then this goes up here, and so U upper bar increases, which means that the possible power shifts that don't cause a war goes up. This is the set of all power shifts without 1992 consensus that would cause a war. So 1992 consensus does three things. Does this make sense? Do you have questions about this? It buys Taiwan some time and gets some compensation from China in the short term. Number two, it weights your Xianzhuang. It's an actual policy that preserves the status quo. And three, it allows China, it allows this rise to happen without war. It keeps the peace. This is an important point. So when we look back on 1992 consensus and we think, well, that's a bad word. Well, what did it do in the 2000s? It actually prevented a war, probably. It's a big statement because it's hard to prove that. You can't go test this. This is one of the problems with international relations theory. When you test these things, there are a lot of things that are unobserved, right? Those are the data that don't ever exist. So you can't see what the counterfactual is. But what's likely is that the 1992 consensus and the agreement by both parties to rally around this, and China, probably prevented a war from happening. So it keeps the peace, preserves the status quo, and it gets Taiwan some goodies in the short term. These are three big implications. So why don't we keep it? I mean, it's great. It keeps the peace. People don't want to fight. China gives Taiwan stuff. Why does it go away now? Okay, so in the short term, just as a summary, 1992 consensus probably does these things. Short-term preservation of status quo, some short-term concessions, and it keeps the peace. So these may be some of the benefits of 1992 consensus. Okay, so now instead of thinking about what happens in the 1990s and 2000s, let's speed forward to the present time. What happens if we're sitting in period 2? Period 1 already happened. Now we're in period 2, and we discover that R equals 0. Remember, R is the probability that the pie might grow, might get better. In the future, now we're in the future, and we're standing there, and we realize the pie didn't get better. You know, we were hoping that China would democratize. It doesn't look like China's going to democratize now. You know, we're sitting now in time 2, looking back. Okay, we had this dream, this one China dream. It didn't work out. I mean, how many of you believe that China will democratize? 不敢说嘛。还是你相信 China 不会? I think if you look at public opinion polls now, most people think that China will not democratize.
Well, even if China democratizes, it does not necessarily mean peace to Taiwan.
Yeah, this is true. But the original dream, let's just focus on that for a moment. The original dream in the 2000s, did it happen? Can we still say that it might happen? Is there some probability that it might? Well, the probability now might be very, very small. In fact, it might be 0. So what if you get to the, so your point is, maybe it happens, maybe R is greater than 0, but it might be that lambda, you know, the benefit to Taiwan isn't that great. And so lambda might be less than 1. If either of these two things are true, that R equals 0 or lambda is 1 or less than 1, then that means that you're sitting in time 2 and you're saying, wow, it didn't really work out. You know, we had this dream and it didn't pan out. So what now? So let's think about the bargaining problem now when you're sitting in time 2. And what are your options? Okay? So the first assumption we're going to make is that in time 2, one thing happened and one thing didn't happen. China's power rose. China got powerful. We all agree that China is over there now, very powerful. They're very powerful. I do a lot of work with the U.S. Army and the United States. I do some consulting with them, and we do some strategy. We do this stuff together with the U.S. Army. And they're very pessimistic about, I mean, this is maybe too pessimistic, but to talk about. But they think China's military is so powerful that let's just say that they think it's overwhelming, right? So they have arrived. So the first thing that happens is that we're in time 2 and China's power rose, okay? The second thing is that they didn't democratize. And so what you hoped would happen in the 1990s and 2000s didn't happen. They rose, but they didn't democratize. So if that's the case, then we're in time 2. And that means that China now, P prime is very large. And so the government of Taiwan, Waijiabu, they're sitting there and they're thinking about this bargaining problem. China eventually is going to make this demand.
Minimum Affairs Council, not the...
Minimum Affairs Council. Well, it affects everybody and Waijiabu, right? So at the end of the day, it affects voters. China became very powerful, and this is the very simple bargaining problem. They can demand this much, and now Taiwan only gets this much. This is not good. This means, I think, Taiwan won done. So if this is the case, then that means that Taiwan only gets this much because China is really powerful. That's one possibility. What if the power shift didn't happen? So we all believe that China is very powerful. There might be a way that the power shift can be offset so that it's as though it didn't happen, right? So one possibility is that Taiwan is in an inferior bargaining position, and this is what it has to deal with. The other possibility is that, okay, so China didn't democratize, and there's no future dream anymore. But the power shift didn't happen. We'll talk about how in just a minute, but let's just assume together that the power shift didn't happen. Then what's the problem that Taiwan faces? The problem that Taiwan faces is the same problem before. It's the commitment problem. I said it at the very beginning. And that means that at some point in the future, China might be powerful, and so that Taiwan is going to have to make concessions today and tomorrow. Or if that power shift is too big, then you might actually have a war after all. But the war would likely come because of the incentives to move toward independence, right? So if it's the case that r equals 0 and lambda equals 1, that u upper bar is the same as u under bar. So we just go back to the same problem we had before. So the dream was helpful. But without the dream, if there's a power shift, and that means that if there was already a power shift, and that means that Taiwan is in a bad bargaining position today, or if that power shift hasn't happened yet, then we're in the original problem where a future power shift can cause problems for Taiwan, including war. So why would this be true? I mean, we all know that China is more powerful. What could offset China's power advantage? Is there anything that could make China's power advantage go away? What do you think? What?
Commitment from a foreign power.
Commitment from a particular foreign power. I mean, let's just be honest here. Bolivia is not going to help Taiwan. So a commitment from the United States would put us back into a situation where this is the game that we're playing. The danger of this, right, is that, so this might offset. Some of my friends in the Armory are even pessimistic if the United States defends Taiwan, because they think China's that powerful now. But suppose it does offset the power. And that means that any time there's a break in the relationship between the United States and Taiwan, then that constitutes a power shift. And then we have this problem. Anytime there's a little bit of a break, say one administration is more pro-Taiwan and another US administration president is less pro-Taiwan. Whenever that power shift happens, and the United States gets more distant from Taiwan, then you have these incentives for a preventive war. And both sides now have an incentive to play this game, China and Taiwan. So China might look for windows of opportunity when there's a lull in US-Taiwan relations, and then they might attack them. Or Taiwan might look for opportunities to try to make aggressive moves before the United States distances itself too much. And then it takes advantage of that. This is the danger of being too close to the United States, is that then the relationship, and one of the risks is preventive war, the relationship between China and Taiwan and the bargaining implications depends upon politics in the United States. I was actually, to be honest, very worried during the US presidential election. Because there's this insurgency at the US Capitol, there's an attack at the US Capitol. The United States government was very busy. That's a window of opportunity that's dangerous for US allies. Those small windows of opportunity, this is actually what my article was about that's revising to submit. What happens in these windows of opportunity before or after there's a power shift that has to do with an alliance. So let's just look at public opinion now compared to the early 2000s. At the end of 2019, a minority, less than half of those surveyed in Taiwan, believe that the status quo can be maintained without war now. So compare that to the 2004 survey. 2004, almost 90% thought this Weiqi Xianzhuang could work. Now most people think that it doesn't. That means that in people's hearts, they think that we're very close to something like this. A situation where China's power has risen, Taiwan's bargaining position is not very good, and you can't maintain the status quo anymore. Or they think that the only option for Taiwan is to get close to the United States. In which case, you still can't preserve the status quo because the power shift depends upon the relationship between Taiwan and the United States. It can change at any time. So what now? What are the policy options? I'm hoping you can help me with this. We have some experts in the room. Hopefully you can help me and give me some ideas. One possibility is that there's no relationship with the United States and Taiwan's bargaining position is inferior. It's bad. It's in a bad situation. The other option is that you try to offset China's power advantage with a relationship with the United States. But then there are those problems too, which I described. But there's a third possibility. Let's not call it 1992 consensus. Let's call it something else. It doesn't matter. Is there any other possible future expansion of the pie? Is there room for creative bargaining between China and Taiwan that does the same thing as 1992 consensus? Does that make sense? Is there something else that can induce an arrangement or cooperation between both China and Taiwan to Weiqi Xianzhuang, to kick the can down the road? Are there any more of these creative bargaining options on the table? If not, then it really does look a little bit pessimistic. So we should probably think about these three different things. What types of creative diplomacy strategies are available? Okay, so this is how you can help me. Does this match your conception of 1992 consensus? If so, what's different? What have I done wrong? What other factors do I need to consider? Can you think of other examples in international politics outside of China and Taiwan where you have the same type of thing, where both sides have an incentive to kick the can down the road, to delay both sides because of the same thing? You have a power shift, but you also have a belief that the future pie is going to be better. And then the last thing you can help me think about is this. New belief. So what types of creative diplomacy options are available? How can China and Taiwan engage each other creatively to avoid some of these downsides that come as a result of China now being in a very powerful position and very confident in its government type and not likely to democratize? Okay, I took, I think, exactly the amount of time I could take. So let's have a conversation. Let's talk. Ask me questions. I'll ask you questions. Let's have a discussion. Go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question about.
What's your name again?
Ari.
Ari?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, for sure. This one's dead.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, talk loud.
Okay. It's about nuclear proliferation within Taiwan. So I think in the 90s, Taiwan shelved its clandestine nuclear program in order to preserve relations with the United States. So if there's the threat that United States commitment is decreasing, do you think that if Taiwan restarted its clandestine nuclear program, that could shift the calculus?
Yeah, so it could if the power transition was immediate. But so a couple of things are true about nuclear programs. They don't happen overnight. There are only a couple of countries in the world that can become nuclear that fast. Japan is one of them. But they don't happen overnight, so they take time. The second thing is that other countries know when a country, now they know, their surveillance is good enough that they know when a country is trying to become nuclear. So China would know if Taiwan tried to invest in nuclear power, or weaponized nuclear power. And because it takes a while for it to happen, they would know that there's going to be a power shift. They know that in the future their bargaining position would be worse. A nuclear weapons program in Taiwan would be a deal changer. It certainly would. But it would also cause China to attack Taiwan now.
So when they had the clandestine nuclear program in the past, was China unaware or they were unable to respond?
They were unable to respond. They may have been.
Perhaps back to the 70s, Taiwan.
Yeah. I don't think it was in the 90s. I think it was in the 70s.
I think there were two iterations. right?
Yeah, we indeed developed the nuclear power, and also we built up that kind of in Tsinghua Daxue. But American, you know the story.
Yeah.
We have a Zhang Xianyi work
Yeah.
for the Zhongke Then he actually is CIA.
Yeah.
So he was escaped to United States and
Yeah.
totally dismantled
Yeah.
by the U.S.
Yeah,
forced
the-
by U.S.
U.S.
government.
You know, the U.S. put a lot of pressure to shut that program down.
Shut down the whole
Yeah.
program.
I thought they clandestinely restarted it in the 90s.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I know about the 70s version of it. I'm sure that even in the 70s, China knew about it.
But
We do
China-
know enough to-
China did not have enough power to destroy.
They didn't have enough power in the
At
70s.
that time,
yeah.
yeah.
The 1990s, they didn't either. I mean, we think that China has not until just recently actually developed the capability to launch an amphibious attack on Taiwan. And in the 1990s, they didn't have missiles. So there's very little they could have done. Taiwan was in an enviable position for a long time.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I would like to say the game theory. Right now, your design only involves two player, Taiwan mainland, right?
Kind of.
Kind of.
Yeah.
But actually, you know the cross-strait relation is not about Taiwan and mainland. U.S. is an important key
Yeah.
player.
So this,
So pivotal. So you're kind of this game, if you don't take American into account, kind of too superficial.
so yes and no. So this right here, when we think about the United States in this particular case, all we're talking about is the power, the bargaining of power across the Taiwan Strait, and that's P. And so P is either China versus Taiwan or China versus Taiwan and the United States. So it affects P in terms of the key strategic moves in bargaining. Now the United States can put pressure on Taiwan and it can do other things like that. So what's helpful is just to abstract away the United States in terms of strategic moves, and then think about their impact on the direct bargaining problem between China and Taiwan in terms of P.
So this kind of a bargaining or calculation is not really based upon Taiwanese leaders, actually based upon American political leaders.
Yeah,
To a
it's-
certain extent.
it's
Let
based-
me kind of restore the kind of historical fact.
yeah.
You talking about 1992 consensus?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, you know the name by Suu Kyi in the year 2000. From what I know, learned from the kind of insider, they attend the 92 consensus meeting,
Yeah.
so-called 92 consensus meeting. When they just try to forming some consensus, either we reject that. Not recognize so-called, because mainland China insists two sides agree with one China principle.
Yeah.
Then we say no at that time. So after 8 years, 1992, then Li Denghui actually, you have to think about, I think it's interesting, Li Denghui mentioned a special state-to-state relation in the year 1999.
Yeah.
Before he stepped down, because Chen Shui-bian going to be elected. Toward the year 2000, actually at that time, Li Denghui didn't know whether Paul Kennedy will lose power or not.
Yeah.
In 1992, summer, in August, he made a kind of announcement,
Yeah.
say a special state-to-state relation. Based upon Li Denghui's understanding so far, and Li Denghui never accepted so-called 92 consensus,
Yeah.
even after Suu Kyi say that.
Uh,
And so when Chen Shui-bian took power, both Tsai Ing-wen and Chen Ming-tong Tsai Ing-wen at that time was the chairperson of the Mainland China Affairs Council.
yeah. Right.
Chen Ming-tong was the deputy. Chen Ming-tong immediately said there's no such kind of 92 consensus
Yeah.
at that time. Back to the history. Maybe by your model, maybe Li Denghui already noticed that kind of China's growing power.
Yeah.
Say he tried to do something, try to reject something bargaining, but he accepted. American government, AIT, Richard Bush
Yeah.
come to the Prime Minister office, say you shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
So Taiwan is not so autonomous
Yeah.
to make decision upon the kind of cross-strait relations. And U.S. kind of bargaining, even merge the U.S. law with a kind of a P.
Yeah.
But still, difficult to calculate.
Yeah.
We are not so autonomous
Yeah.
in terms of making decisions for cross-strait
So-
bargaining.
So this is an excellent point. Thank you for the added insight. So the actor here is just player 2,
Yeah,
and it's
difficult to count. Take the third person.
yeah. In a way, it doesn't matter as long as there's an actor who's making this decision. It could be a bureaucracy. It could be the United States and Taiwan together. It's the actual policy that comes out. It's the sort of revealed decision that we understand ex post. I've talked to Suu Kyi about this a lot, and the key I think that we have come to agree on is that what made it possible, because it did have currency. What people agree on, whether it's the name 1992 consensus or not, is that there's pressure in Taiwan to take the preventive move, to declare independence. And by rallying around this with the pressure of the United States, the rhetoric was that made it possible was a belief that the future can be better. And that's the key that gets the airplane off the ground. And then of course it sticks for several years. The alternative is that there's a move toward independence and there's probably conflict.
For our electorate, because we are kind of election study
Yeah.
person, we said if we treat voters as a regional actor, voter, Taiwanese voter,
Yeah.
but there's always information kind of a gap
Right.
between voters and so-called elites. So what you got, certainly because you have to read the public opinion poll, but by our explanation about the kind of gap between the kind of like during the 2004,
Yeah.
80%, 89% of Taiwanese voters still accept 92 consensus,
Yeah.
and right now a lot less, right? And also you said kind of whether they believe in China's future will be growing power or not. Actually, what people react to the phenomenon or the question whether China will be a growing power or not. By rational choice approach, they do not have first-hand information.
Yeah.
They listen to the elites.
Yeah.
So elites manipulate, give this kind of hope.
So after studying Taiwan public opinion for many years, I have come to a couple of conclusions. One is that Taiwan survey respondents are much more sophisticated than US survey respondents when it comes to foreign policy. And I think there's an easy explanation for this, because there's an information gap, but the average Taiwan voter is incredibly sophisticated by the standards of the world and other democracies. In the United States, major powers throughout history, they can afford to make foreign policy mistakes. And so voters budget that in to how much time they invest in understanding politics. In the United States, a lot of voters don't even know what the US government is doing in foreign policy, and they don't care, because if there's a mistake, it doesn't impact them that much. In Taiwan, if there's small mistakes, then people feel it. And so a lot of voters tend to be, the gap between elites and voters in Taiwan is smaller than the gap between elites and voters in the United States. So there is still a gap, but at least it's better than.
I know, better than United States,
But it's
but still not better than elites.
Yeah. Like we mentioned at lunch, so there's this trend in Taiwan. If you ask voters, in many surveys, not all of them, but if you ask voters if they think the United States will defend Taiwan, if they think that the United States will defend Taiwan if Taiwan declares independence and China attacks. So that's a very, very limiting case, right? Something like north of 65 to 75% of people in Taiwan believe the United States will defend Taiwan. In the United States, if you ask people, do you want to defend Taiwan in any circumstance, like 25% say yes. So in the United States, there's 25% that say we want to. In Taiwan, there's 65 to 75% of people say they will, even though they don't want to. They'll defend Taiwan. Probably somewhere in between. What happens in the United States is when there's a crisis, then people are like, yeah, let's go fight. And so that one goes up. But this number, the confidence number in Taiwan is by itself a puzzle. Elites can drive a lot of that, but there can be other reasons for that too. Okay, what other questions do you have? Yeah, there's lots of questions back. Okay, go for it.
Okay.
What's your name?
Maulana.
Okay.
Let's say that for the current time, like present time, for the past 4 years, there are numbers of Chinese military exercise in the Taiwan Straits or near Taiwan. So my question is, does it imply China doesn't no longer want to kicking the can down the road, or it still remain as the part of the bargaining to Taiwan from China's standpoint?
I'm sorry. So the question is, does China want to kick the can down the road?
No longer want to kick the can down the road, or it still remain as the bargaining chip for China.
So because this is a very good question. So let's talk about it. So I think the question is, now what does China want? Do they want to delay to realize more power growth, or are they ready? When I talk to people in Taiwan, I ask this question, something related to this, that a lot of people, it's really weird, a lot of people say, well, now Hong Kong happened, and now Taiwan's next. It's now our turn, which is really pessimistic. And then you look in public opinion polls, a lot of people want independence. But then you look at other questions of public opinion polls, and people will say, I don't want to fight. Let somebody else fight. I don't want to fight. It's hard to want independence and not want to fight. These two things are going in separate directions. But it is kind of strange because there does seem to be, at least among some people, a belief that, okay, Taiwan's next and we're just waiting to see what happens. The question is, does China have an incentive to kick the can down the road anymore? And the third option that I put here, creative diplomacy, depends on this. Something that could convince China to kick the can down the road. I have some ideas.
Share with us. How you create the bigger pie.
It seems to me, maybe I will, maybe I won't. So, but I want some of your ideas. So right now, China's waiting, I think, to see what the Biden administration, if it's going to be like the Trump administration. It looks to me like the United States is preparing to invest heavily in this region. It looks to me like they feel like they have overinvested in the Middle East. And it looks to me like it doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat. The United States wants to invest here now. I believe that in my conversations with people that I think understand in the United States, they think the United States is underprepared right now to defend Taiwan. But I actually think that increasingly people in the United States want to be in a position to defend all US allies and even Taiwan, because China has made it easy to make that position popular. With Hong Kong and Xinjiang and some of these things, you should see public opinion polls in the United States. China is not popular in the United States now. I mean, it's public enemy number one. It feels like Cold War. I don't like it. But that means that the United States has an opening. And I think that Democrat and Republican both feel like they want to invest here. But it's also the case that U.S. economy heavily depends on China. These things are linked. And so I think that China is waiting to see if that happens. If the United States invests here, then that means that there's going to be a power shift in Taiwan's advantage in the future. And so China doesn't have any incentive to wait. But I think it wants to wait to see what Biden does. I don't think China believes it needs to gain any more power if it's just Taiwan. I think that they are thinking, okay, if it's Taiwan and the United States, we need to figure out who it's. Can we do this in 10 days, or is it going to take a year? I think that's the calculation. And if it can be done in 10 days, that means the United States is out of the picture. If it's going to take longer than that, then international public opinion and costs start to go up, and Xi Jinping becomes unpopular. That's the other calculation. So I think that China is only waiting now to figure out what the United States is going to do. That's what I think. And I think a lot of people in Taiwan are waiting for Xi Jinping to die. I think a lot of people mistakenly believe that Xi Jinping is a unique historical moment, and then maybe Hu Yaobang is going to come back next. I think that that's a misguided notion. I don't think it just depends on Xi Jinping. But this is a good question. Yeah. What other questions do you have? Yeah.
One quick question, but maybe not within the framework in your formal model, in which how would China be a credible player if we don't believe what China are talking about and how, suppose suppose Taiwan reach an agreement with China and China break his promise in a maybe T3, since from other start at T2, then what would Taiwan get?
So the question is about China's credibility. We need to ask the question, credible about what? Do you believe that they're not credible, that they would, if they make a demand, that they'll actually attack? Are you, so that in the model, the only thing that really matters in terms of credibility is China makes this demand. If Taiwan doesn't accept, is China really willing to fight? That's a question about credibility. Is China really willing to fight to back up its demand? China hasn't made that demand yet. They say things like, if Taiwan doesn't do this soon, then there's going to, it makes sort of these oblique threats, but it hasn't said yet, if you don't come to the bargaining table by 2022, then we will attack. They haven't said that yet. That's a demand. What's happening right now is that both sides are trying to gobble up this pie bite by bite. So China is like, okay, we're going to fight to the midline, then we'll cross it, and then we'll go a little bit farther, and we'll see if we can eventually just walk on Taiwan's beaches with our military. At what point will Taiwan just say no? Maybe we'll fly over Jilong. Maybe we'll try to just fly over the island. That's a way to just start to gobble up the pie. If you can get people comfortable with seeing military aircraft, that's a way to gobble up the pie. So Taiwan is doing some of those things too, right? It's trying to just say, we're not declaring independence, but we are a little bit closer than we were before. That UN ambassador in the United States? Sure, come see us. It's never happened before, but come see us, and this is not anything that's really different. These things matter. But in terms of credibility, what are you actually talking about?
I'm thinking about the question is, suppose Taiwan and China reach agreement, and that would probably affect U.S. position to the U.S. relation with Taiwan. So in that sense, Taiwan may give up something when we reach agreement with China, and maybe like Hong Kong today, they break out the agreement. Then if we have this expectation on China, then it might change our bargaining at T2.
Okay, yeah, I understand. It seems like you had a comment like this before when we had lunch. Yes. Okay, so I think what the question is this. So suppose it's the case that the status quo is here. That means that Taiwan gets already this much. And China comes along and says, we're going to change the status quo to reflect our power. We're going to take this much. Now, it's still better than war for you, so you should accept. But it means that we're going to take some stuff away from you, right? So China's credibility doesn't matter there. What you're saying is China's credibility matters if it says one country, two systems, and Taiwan's like, okay, but we don't really believe you. That's not a position that would actually be offered. What would happen is China would say, if you don't take, this is the way it works in the model, if you don't take one country, two systems, then we attack. So you choose. The only thing that really matters about credibility is whether they're really going to attack or not. And so the negotiations kind of look like that. The outside option is always what you can get if you walk away from the table and you jump in your military aircraft. One country, two systems worked for Hong Kong for a long time. The reason it changed is because China got more powerful. And the change just reflects the power shift. So Hong Kong was here, and then China became more powerful, and then that's what happened. So it just reflects a representation of the power. The only thing that really requires credibility here is, you can get this, one country, two systems, it'll work for you for a long time, but eventually China's going to be more powerful, then it's going to be this. That's the tough thing. So we're not actually talking about a situation where Taiwan says, okay, we're going to go out on a limb and trust you. In the future, if China's more powerful, it is true that China will take more. It is always going to take what's commensurate with its power. That's what countries do in the world. They take what they can get. And in the future, China's more powerful, it's going to take it. The question is, what type of an arrangement will work here, and then one in the future? it's better if you can kick the can down the road, because then you don't have to do any of that type of stuff. Don't have to make any of those concessions about one country, two systems, or anything like that. Does that answer your question? Yeah. What other questions do you have or comments? I still need you to help me. So have I correctly characterized the strategic logic? So Professor Liao has helped me with this. I need to think a little bit more about U.S. role and actually doing the bargaining, not just the fighting. What else? What are some creative solutions for bargaining going forward? Is it just basically either Taiwan has a relationship with the United States or accept its inferior bargaining position? Are there other types of solutions?
Before I can answer that question,
I mean, we're being recorded, so I probably won't tell you any of my ideas.
We can shut it down.
Shut it down, and then we'll talk honestly among each other.
Yeah. At 4 o'clock, we'll shut it down. Yeah.
15 minutes from now.
15 minutes, we shut it down, then we talk honestly.
Did you ever get a comment or response, doesn't matter where, in Taiwan or in the US, that your research pretty much reflects the blue camp's mindset? That 92 consensus is useful. It has a strategic value. And whatever happened between 2014 and 2016 for Taiwan is a mistake. That Taiwan should have stayed on the course of 92 consensus. Did you ever get a comment or the Green Camp people ever frown on your research design? Because to them, 92 consensus is more than, when they talk about 92 consensus, to them it is a normative question rather than an instrumental or rational question. Is it useful? That's not the question they ask. Is it right or wrong? Mm-hmm. To them that is moral, or that's about their belief. Yeah. The 92 consensus, if it is always about one China principle or one China policy, then they don't want to have anything to do with that.
Yeah. So I think this is a good question, a fair question. The good news is that I don't have to be blue or green. I'm a political scientist.
Lucky you.
So for me, what's moral doesn't have to be part of the question. A lot of times, what's moral is a way of achieving currency in populations to get votes. And what matters to me is why it worked when it worked and why it went away. So it had to work. It had to work for some reason. And this is, to me, is the logic. If it's wrong, then I'm just a political scientist. I want to understand why. But the question about if you just stay the course in 2014, 15, and 16, we made a mistake. This analysis doesn't say that rational actors make mistakes. It meant that it was rational to do away with it. And the reason why it fell was not because Taiwan made a mistake. It's because R equals 0 and lambda is 1. The future dream didn't happen. And then, as soon as that happens, the 1992 consensus collapses under the weight of its own rhetoric. And then it becomes a political issue.
Maybe decision makers or politicians made a mistake by ignoring the shift in balance, or like what you said, R is 0 and lambda is 1. They ignore that situation.
So I don't think that they did, and I think this is why it collapsed, right? So the shift in power, Taiwan can't do anything about that. That's going to happen. That's outside of Taiwan's power. So it happened, and how come, right? I mean, it is what it is. China's getting more powerful, and the rest of the world has to deal with that. The United States too. But then China did some things that convinced the whole world that it was not going to become democratic. The first thing is that Xi Jinping said no more term limits. And then people here and around the world heard that. It was a very loud statement. that China is moving away from democracy and institutions. And then it said some things about Taiwan, and then Hong Kong happened. If you remember in 2018, it looked like Tsai Ing-wen was not going to be reelected, right? Public opinion here was very, very different. KMT was actually on the rise. It wasn't 2014, 2015. It was the belief that China is not going to democratize. Things over there, this one country, two systems idea is broken. It's not going to work. And then everything changed. I mean, there are a couple of things that happened. The trade war helped Tsai Ing-wen because economy here was suffering. But one of the things that really mattered was a demonstration, an anti-democratic demonstration in China that convinced people here that the future that we're holding out for is not going to happen. And so I think that these are the patterns that reflect this. If you look back, the reason why it happened in the 1919 consensus is because it worked. In retrospect, if we know what we knew now, so this is the sort of the green side of things. If we knew then what we know now, that China wasn't going to democratize, and that we were going to end up here, then maybe back in 2000, maybe we should have gone for independence. Maybe that would have been the best strategy. But the truth is that nobody knew, and it's a worthy strategy if you think that you can actually influence the democratization of 1.3 billion people. Then maybe that's a good strategy. So at the time, it was a good strategy. It worked until it was clear that the future was not going to turn out that way. So I'm not sure that sounds very blue or green. I think it just is an analysis of things as they are, but maybe not.
I have a very quick question. How do you explain why China now pick up the 92 consensus and insist that Tsai Ing-wen should honor the 92 consensus? Then we can start a kind of a new negotiation. Why?
Oh, this is the $6 million question. You tell me the answer to that. What do you think?
Still, China want to kick the can down the road, or for what reason? Yeah, by your kind of model.
Wow. So we're on camera. 4 o'clock. Yeah.
We can close the camera.
My KMT friends tell me, yeah. 关掉. Yeah.
In the beginning, China refused the 92 consensus.
Yeah.
After a while, China, okay.